Chapter 3. The Waldorf's reception room was bustling with activity as the dinner party began to assemble. Marcellus arrived first, greeted by Kimberly. Soon after, Solicitor Christopher Lee made his entrance, followed by Colonel Drake and his daughters, with Alfonso and his mother bringing up the rear. Mrs. Drake was dressed in a stunning black satin gown with jet trimmings and Van Dyke lace, while Kimberly's light blue filet silk dress adorned with pearls and guipure lace was equally impressive. Marcellus complimented her on her attire, causing her to feel a flutter of excitement. Mr. Lee engaged Marcellus in a conversation about Italy's contributions to literature and art, sitting opposite Mrs. Drake at the Colonel's right. Kimberly and Marcellus were seated at the end of the table, with Alfonso and Laura on either side. Other hotel guests and their friends were scattered throughout the dining room, chatting amiably. The soft glow of electric lights and pretty shades at each table added to the ambience. As the conversation turned to higher education for women, Mrs. Drake eagerly asked Mr. Lee for his opinion. Laura chimed in, requesting to hear about the English girl's experiences. Kimberly added a playful inquiry about whether or not the girl rode a bicycle. Mr. Lee shared his views on the subject, surprising the group with his liberal stance. It was no wonder, as his own mother and sisters were strong intellectual forces in Lincolnshire, pursuing a similar course of study as Christopher had in university, aided by tutors and their scholarly mother. Lee believed in giving women absolute freedom to pursue their dreams, as long as they could do it as well as men. Colonel Drake shared this belief and advocated for his daughters to have healthy bodies and minds, and the ability to reason soundly. Kimberly believed in an education that would conserve and enlarge women's graces, delicate feelings, and love for the beautiful. Marcellus and Alfonso agreed with Kimberly's views. Mrs. Drake also believed that women were capable of receiving and profiting from a college education. Lee believed that America offered better education to women than England, but England gave women more freedom in politics. He believed that educating women was a part of humanity and gave them a self-centered poise, making them competent heads of the home. Lee felt that women possessed the finest and highest qualities, and that it was their mission to incorporate these qualities into society. Laura thanked Lee for his views, and the party withdrew to the Winter Garden Cafe. Laura read to her mother, while the men stepped outside for a smoke and discussed the tariff question. Lee favored free trade and believed in the inborn right of everybody to trade as they liked in the world's cheapest markets. Colonel Drake, wounded in his patriotism, was taken aback by Lee's comment about Americans being too obsessed with money. He thanked Lee for his interest in studying America, but then challenged him, saying that human nature is the same everywhere. Nations always legislate for their own interests. Americans work hard for money, but so do the English with their love for the golden sovereign. Drake pointed out that there were monuments to protection on all the streets of Lee's city, built under British tariff laws. Even the stones in St. Paul's Cathedral were laid with a duty of $1 per ton on all coal imported into London. Selfishness, not brotherly love, drove England to adopt free trade. Lee disagreed with Drake, but Drake was ready with his argument. He believed that nobody had the right to trade in the world's cheapest markets unless their own country permitted it. Any nation could adopt free trade, but they needed 4 things: cheap labor, cheap capital, cheap raw material, and a virile population that believed in God's command to be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it. England had all of these things, which is why they were able to repeal the Corn Laws and make labor cheaper. Capital in the financial metropolis of the world was quick to discover surplus labor. The English had already made significant advancements in machinery for the production of goods such as iron, cotton, and wool, which resulted in cheaper labor and products. With cheap capital and labor, England had 2 of the necessary components to expand its trade with the world. The third requirement, abundant and cheap raw materials, was also obtained through the import of materials via their vessels. For 3 centuries, England had followed Sir Walter Raleigh's advice that whoever commands the sea commands the trade, and whoever commands the trade commands the riches of the world. Inspired by divine guidance, English capital sought investment opportunities globally, and with cheap capital, labor, and raw materials, they could compete successfully with the world. Therefore, it was understandable that British manufacturers and politicians sought a large market abroad, which necessitated free trade. Advocating for other nations to adopt free trade publicly would not be wise, so the principle of free trade for the world had to be sugar-coated to be acceptable. Advocates of free trade believed that the larger the number of buyers, the higher the prices. When America can command cheap capital, labor, and raw materials, they too can advocate for free trade. Protection and free trade are both selfish principles, not philanthropic ones. Christopher Lee did not respond to Mr. Drake's comment, possibly because it was late, or he did not want to antagonize Colonel Drake, with whom he hoped to strike a good deal. Both Lee and Drake agreed to meet the next morning to discuss business. Lee woke up early, had breakfast, and walked to the Battery before the appointed time for his first business meeting with Evander Drake. Colonel Drake was in a jovial mood at breakfast, and joked around while smoking and reading the Tribune and examining Lee's letter of introduction from Messrs. Gurney and Baring. At precisely 9 o'clock, Mr. Lee arrived, and Colonel Drake presented him with a concise report on the Drakeville Iron and Steel Coaster's business for the past decade, including the company's annual profits. "Your company has done quite well and made significant profits, Colonel Drake," remarked Lee. "Have you factored in depreciation of buildings and machinery, as well as all losses and insurance costs in your statement? And after these deductions, can we conclude that the company's net profits annually average over £100,000, or $500,000? "Yes," replied the Colonel. Lee responded, "Colonel Drake, if your arguments from last evening didn't fully convince me of the advantages Americans gain from protection, this statement of the Drakeville Iron and Steel Company certainly does. Some Americans in London brought your profitable plant to our attention a year ago, which prompted our initial inquiry. Your responses confirmed the report, and so we cabled for this meeting. Mr. Gurney and Mr. Baring have been highly successful in financing some of the largest business interests in the world, and they have earned an excellent reputation. They have requested that I secure your most favorable terms with an option to purchase your plant, which will be valid for 2 months or sufficient time to organize a syndicate and float necessary debentures to buy the stock or a controlling interest in your company, and continue the business. Mr. Lee, we Americans are not eager to sell our most profitable concerns, especially to foreigners. We should keep them under our own control. However, lately, I have been considering indulging my family in some foreign travel and allowing myself more leisure time for books and perhaps politics, as I believe not enough of our good citizens enter Congress. I could name a price for all the stock of the Drakeville Iron and Steel Company under certain conditions. Please state the price and conditions. Well, let me ponder for a moment. The capital stock of the company is not as large as it should be. Total capital stock $2 million, par value of shares $100, present value per share $300. The entire property and goodwill of the company is worth at least $6 million, and my fixed price, as the English say, is $5 million. Mr. Lee appeared perplexed, as he had hoped to purchase the stock for less money. He hesitated, as if in deep thought, but not for long, as he believed that if the Drakeville Iron and Steel Company could pay $500,000 or an average annual dividend of 25% on its stock of $2 million for 10 successive years, the reorganized plant could be marketed at a neat profit of, say, £1.4 million in London, where even sound 3% investments are eagerly sought. So, Mr. Lee inquired again, "Colonel Drake, you omitted to state your conditions." Drake replied, "I must have enough cash to guarantee the sale and short-term payments for the balance." "Well, Colonel Drake, how would the following terms suit you?" The proposed deal was laid out before Colonel Drake, who was asked to consider the payment options. The first option was an eighth of the total price, which amounted to $625,000, to be paid in 30 days. The second option was also an eighth of the price, but to be paid in 60 days. The third option was a quarter of the total price, to be paid in 90 days. The fourth option was a quarter of the price, but in the form of preferred shares with a guaranteed 6% dividend. The total price was set at $5 million. Mr. Lee then explained his London plan for reorganizing the company. The plan involved changing the company name to the Drakeville Iron and Steel Company, Limited of London, England, and capitalizing it at $7 million. The company would issue 70,000 shares with a par value of $100. The option to purchase the property would be signed after experts verified the correctness of Colonel Drake's statements. The first payment would be made, and the contract underwritten by the Guardian, Executor and Trust Association, Limited, of London, whose capital was $5 million. The association would also underwrite the bonds and preference shares. To cover the last one-fourth payment of $1,250,000, the company would issue debentures or bonds for $4 million at 4% over 30 years, preference shares for $2 million with a guaranteed 6% dividend, and ordinary shares for $6 million, which could earn at least 5%. Colonel Drake would take 12,500 preferred shares for the last one-fourth payment. The London holders would elect all the officers, a managing board of directors, and have a general office in London. Colonel Drake would advise in the management of the business at Drakeville for a time. After further explanations, Colonel Drake agreed to sign a contract or option of purchase if he was satisfied with the responsibility of the London parties. Contracts were presented on Tuesday morning, and after careful consideration, Colonel Drake approved and wrote a letter of introduction to his manager at Drakeville. On Wednesday, Mr. Lee and his experts would examine all property and accounts of the company for 10 years back. If everything was satisfactory, all parties would sign the agreement, and the cash payment would be made at Gurney and Baring's London office. The exacting Colonel Drake ran his family and labour force with precision. At 6 o'clock each morning, the family gathered for breakfast, where Colonel Drake would quickly bless the meal. By 6:30, he was at his mills, walking through as his skilled labourers began their work. His devotion to his work brought him success. After breakfast, Mrs. Drake and her daughters went shopping while the sons prepared for their long-awaited trip to Europe. Jean made sure all their luggage was transferred to the steamer, and by 10:30 they were ready to set sail. Excitement filled the air as they made their way to the dock, where they were greeted by friends and well-wishers. As they boarded the steamer, Colonel Drake felt a sense of relief to finally take a vacation after 25 years of hard work. But just as he entered the dining saloon, he received a telegram from his manager, Wilson, informing him that 4,000 of his men had gone on strike for higher wages. Drake was stunned, but quickly composed himself and made a decision on how to handle the situation. He approached the ship's purser, relinquishing his passage ticket and bidding farewell to his wife and 2 daughters. "Alfonso," he said to his son, "take charge of the party as I return to Drakeville." Despite Laura's protests, she accompanied her father and remained on the dock. Colonel Drake, Laura, and Mr. Lee stood on the pier, waving their white handkerchiefs to Mrs. Drake, Kimberly, Alfonso, and Marcellus. What a dismal send-off. As the Scottish poet Robert Burns wrote, "The best laid schemes o' mice and men gang after glee, and leave us naught but grief and pain for promised joy." Both the Drakes on the steamer and the Drakes on the pier were heavy-hearted, especially Colonel Drake and Laura, who were suddenly disappointed. It was soon decided that the 3 of them would depart for Drakeville that evening.